The Centre for Midwifery, Child and Family Health at the University of Technology, Sydney, and the Australian Centre for Child Protection at the University of South Australia have worked together to produce these resources. These have been made possible by the generous donation from the Ian Potter Foundation. They're designed to help midwives and nurses prevent child abuse and neglect. We also hope that they will be useful to a broad range of students and practitioners working with families. Before we look at some of the risk and protective factors associated with child abuse and neglect, let us remind ourselves of the images of children. Here we see a group of Indigenous children. This slide speaks to me in several ways. One, it speaks to me of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in state care in Australia, 9 times more likely than non-Indigenous children. It also speaks to me of the high rates of fetal alcohol syndrome, failure to thrive, neglect and sexual abuse, as well as the witnessing of domestic violence and parental mental health problems and parental substance misuse problems that children in some Indigenous communities experience in Australia. Part of that is the legacy of the forced removal of children from their families by an earlier era of child protection policies. We could also see in this slide the joy and the beauty and the resilience of children, regardless of their colour, their class or their culture. This image could be seen as a mirror opposite of the previous one, of a group of Anglo-Celtic children in affluence. And while it's true that child abuse and neglect is associated with social disadvantage, we now understand from surveys done with young people and young adults that regardless of socioeconomic status, a significant proportion of children in our society have experienced child abuse and neglect. So preventing child abuse and neglect is something we need to do for all children in our society, not just specific subgroups. This image also speaks to me of the fact that each child is unique and looks at us through their own lens, sees the world and what we do in a unique way. It's been said in The Lancet in 2003 that maltreatment is one of the biggest paediatric public health challenges, yet any research activity is dwarfed by work on more established childhood ills. However, we have got more knowledge than we've ever had before on the risk and protective factors associated with child abuse and neglect, and a growing body of knowledge on effective interventions. However, sometimes the gap between what we know and what we do is greater than the gap between what we know and what we don't know. We have a strong body of research identifying some of the key risk and protective factors in relation to child abuse and neglect. Poverty is one of those risk factors. Not just material poverty, but the sense of hopelessness and despair and demoralisation that can be engendered in families living with the situational stressors of poverty and the stigma of poverty. Parental substance misuse is a major risk factor for child abuse and neglect, particularly alcohol abuse, with 13.2% of Australian children living in households with at least one parent who's regularly binge drinking. This presents not only the risk of fetal alcohol syndrome, but massively increases the risk of child physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse and neglect in these families. About 50% of children brought into state care have at least one parent with an alcohol problem. Parents with a mental illness have a greater challenge in raising children than when they are not mentally ill. But a great deal can be done, as with parents with an intellectual disability, to support parents raising their children under those circumstances. For example, mothers suffering from depression, through no fault of their own, may struggle to form a close and deep bond to their child, and may also, because they are withdrawn, provide an environment which is less rich in terms of verbal interaction and cognitive stimulation for their young child. The protective factors are as important to understand as the risk factors, and midwives and nurses in particular have enormous potential to strengthen the protective factors in relation to child abuse and neglect. Foremost among protective factors is the depth of the attachment between parents and their children. This factor is so important because it allows the parent to emotionally take the position of the young child, to actually see the world through the lens, through the eyes of that child, and to be sensitive and responsive to the child's feelings. It strengthens the motivation to protect children from a whole range of dangers. And it provides the warm and loving environment in which children thrive. Nurses and midwives have an enormous role to play, particularly with young children and their families, in strengthening parental attachment. Spacing between births is also known to be a protective factor. So having a baby at a very young age and having closely spaced children creates a burden which can sometimes be associated with child neglect. And last but not least, social support is a major protective factor. That social support normatively comes from the kith and kinship webs of relationships into which we are born, our family, our friends. But professionals, for example, child and family health nurses, running groups for young parents, may strengthen the neighbourhood networks and actually be something like the village well, which brings together people in a community to develop strong and mutually supportive networks. These are just some of the risk and protective factors which nurses and midwives can have an influence upon. From a public health approach, preventing child abuse and neglect requires us at a population level to reduce the level of risk factors and increase the level of protective factors. Just as if we were tackling a problem such as skin cancer, we need to address this at a broad structural level as well as through our services to children and families. In relation to our service system, there are 4 things we need to do if we're going to enhance the ability of our services to prevent child abuse and neglect, and when it occurs, to respond more effectively to it. Firstly, we need to build the capacity within both child-focused services and adult-focused services for child and family-sensitive practice. So, for example, a nurse who has her primary client as the child, a paediatric nurse, needs to be able to see the whole of the family as her client. Similarly, a mental health nurse who has her primary client as the parent with a mental illness needs to be able to see the child and the parent as her unit of attention. And of course, for midwives who see both the infant and the parent as their unit of attention, there are complex challenges when the needs of both mother and infant may sometimes be at odds with one another in child protection situations. But striving for a family-centred perspective in our practice, regardless of whether our primary client is the child or is the parent, is the principle which needs to guide us in developing our services. The second principle is building bridges between sectors. Protecting children is everybody's business, and that means we need to work effectively across health services, education services and social services, as well as with communities in order to achieve this. Thirdly, we need to have organisational culture and climate which allows those working in organisations to feel that they can do the best by the families they're there to serve. And as I'll talk about shortly, we need to strengthen all service providers in relationship-based practice. This logo from the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide symbolically captures seeing both child and parent at the same time in our professional practice. I hope we can all see the child. I hope also in this image we can all see the mother. Can you see them both at the same time? That's a little more difficult, but you can do it if you focus on the boundary between them, which is a lovely metaphor for focusing on the interaction of the parent and child. But can you see the father? That's more challenging. Some people have been able to see the father in this picture, and you may too. Let's make sure that we don't leave fathers out of the picture. Engaging fathers in our work with families can be challenging, particularly for female-dominated professions. And yet, unless we do that, we will not be serving this family or this child as well as we might. And in these resources, you will see some inspiring examples of father-inclusive, family-centred practice. Relationship-based practice is not new to midwives and nurses. It is at the very core of their professional being. And to engage families in all shapes and sizes and different cultural groups, we need to be able to offer relationships which are based on empathy, on respect, on genuineness and optimism. That's not easy to do. And we need to have organisational conditions and peer support which nurtures within us the capacity for relationship-based practice. Working with vulnerable families, families where there is a risk of child abuse and neglect, can be deeply satisfying, as you will see in some of these resources. But it can also be very challenging and very stressful. So midwives and nurses need to look after themselves. They should have available to them high-quality clinical supervision, which provides a sounding board for their reflection upon their practice and upon themselves as the instrument of their own practice, their own feelings, which can get in the way of working effectively with families, which can get in the way of their own well-being. For some practitioners, those who carry with them adversity from their own childhood experiences, which may include experiences of child abuse and neglect, this may provide a deeper and special empathy in working with vulnerable families. But sometimes the issues in the families with whom we work can be very close to home. Professionals who carry within them a vulnerability from their own experiences may require additional assistance to be able to work in these fields and to ensure their own well-being in doing so. Most of all, we need to be able to nurture hope in families. Each child born is a harbinger of hope. And for families who struggle to nurture their children, the children are the most powerful source of hope they will ever have. If we're to work effectively to prevent child abuse and neglect and nurture families to enhance the well-being of their children, we need to find those sources of hope within ourselves and within one another. There are many things that help us do that. Perhaps our evolutionary endowment to cherish children, not just our own children, but all children, is our greatest source of hope.